I'm Brad Massey, the Saunders Foundation Curator of Public History here at the Tampa Bay History Center, and this is part of our Museum from Home segment, and also our History from 6 Feet Away. And we're very lucky today because we have a very important ensemble cast here, and most importantly we have Andy Huse, who is the author of a recent book that came out, and today we're going to talk to him about his book. We also have with us today...
I'm Rodney Kaipau, the director of the Touch and Map Library here at the History Center. And yeah, we couldn't be happier to have Andy here talking about his new book. There's all kinds of great stories about, as the title would imply, saloons and steakhouses. We've had a lot over the years here in Tampa, and some great stories that go with them. So we thought we'd spend the next 20 minutes or so chatting about some of those stories.
Yeah. So the first thing we wanted to ask Andy today is, as Rodney pointed out, the book is called From Saloons to Steakhouses, and there's a lot of different ways you can approach Tampa history, Andy, and it's so interesting. Why did you decide, I want to look at food culture, I want to look at saloon culture. Why do you think that's a good way for us to understand Tampa's past?
Well, first of all, because I've always liked to talk about food and things like that, just because I kind of think of it as a Trojan horse for history. Everyone thinks they're learning about food and they're learning about history. And that's sort of kind of what happened to me in the course of writing the book was, I wanted to document Tampa in a different way. And all of my colleagues in Southern history were kind of doing very kind of direct type things. So it's like, I'm going to write about civil rights or something like that. And I thought maybe it would be interesting to tap into some commonalities and then branch off from there. It all happened kind of organically and accidentally, but it started by me being really interested in food because I thought this was something that no one had really tackled before. This is back in 1997 when I was in graduate school. So I started to get really interested in food, but then I started to realize that the places serving this stuff were kind of more interesting, and the stories, that happened inside these places were more interesting. And then I started to realize that really, the idea of food and drink sort of masks this constant social conflict and upheaval that, we've seen over the last century. So I think it was a way to access all those things, but it really took 20 years of exploration, really, in history to arrive at that point.
Yeah.
I wasn't that smart, I think, to think of it first. So.
Yeah, but I can see that when you read the book, and I read it again last night, and as you know, I was fortunate enough to read an early draft of it about a year or so ago. You can really see the 20 years of effort. And I think you really do touch on certain people and certain events that we simply don't think about. But when you go to the saloon, and some of the things we want to hear from you today is, you talk about these blue laws and how they affect Tampa. You talk about some of these early saloons, and then you hear the history of these different people. So when it comes to the first saloons and the first blue laws and these things, what do you think are some of the most interesting stories in the book that readers are going to really enjoy hearing about?
First of all, I think just how strict blue laws used to be, and that it was a territorial law that kind of covered the entire state. Just how variable it could be from community to community.
Yeah, can you tell everybody what a blue law is?
Yeah, so the blue law, there's a territorial law that was put in our Constitution in the 1830s, and it carried over into the Florida Constitution. But it was all about you can't do anything on the Sabbath. If it involves any kind of work, you can't do anything on Sunday. So, that included trains coming through town, newspapers. Police shouldn't be working either by that notion. But so every community dealt with this in a different way. And Tampa didn't seem very bothered about it until the immigrants arrived. So then it became this big fighting thing about, no one can mind their own business. Oh, the immigrants are out having fun on Sunday, and they're doing it at their own park, not, frolicking down the white streets of Tampa. But it was still seen as a huge problem. So I guess for us, it's kind of amusing because it doesn't seem like such a big problem by today's standards, but at the time it was like an existential threat. It was like, I don't know what to, compare it to, abortion, something like that. They're really, very passionate.
And one of the biggest things, sorry, Brad, but we think about Sunday, hopefully we'll be able to do this again, but football and sports.
Right.
But one of the things that they prohibited was baseball.
Right, baseball. They wanted to arrest anyone who went to a game, who played in a game, who sold tickets to a game. And this, of course, clashed with what the majority of people wanted to do. I mean, the immigrants got the brunt of the blame for this, but if all people in Tampa were on the same page, this never would have been an issue. But obviously, it seemed to me like kind of an elite minority driving this message that, we've got to have peace on Sundays.
Yeah, and it was the local priests who were like literally go to these events, right? And,
right.
And cause bring attention to it.
Right. Yeah, there's a particular incident in 1902 that I talk about that. I mean, I think is kind of funny in retrospect. I mean, in the end, they couldn't prove that they were selling beer because none of the preachers had ever tasted beer or seen it or anything. So, and just the wild nature, when Peter O'Knight's supposed to be the prosecutor and he decides to be the defender for, a booze defendant. It's just, it's total chaos.
So you seem to have these countervailing forces in Tampa. As you say, until we see a large surge of immigrants with the cigar industry and the railroads, and then Tampa becomes more cosmopolitan, all of a sudden you have priests and you have other people that want to put these blue laws in place and that want to control drinking. But one of the things you write about is saloon businesses in Tampa are incredibly popular. So there's things like the Key Club, and then one of the early places you talk about is the Imperial Theatre, which is run by an immigrant. And then it comes basically, or I should say it runs afoul of some of these more puritanical elements here in Tampa. So what can you tell us about the Imperial Theatre and why it's so important in saloon history?
Well, I just kept hearing about this, and every time I heard about the theater, it was like that lowly dive and all this stuff, and I'm like, oh, I got to know more,
So the Imperial is this place in the early 1900s, Andy, and it comes to, I guess, represent B-girls, the seediness of Tampa. So you were telling us a little bit about it.
It's really like,
so important?
Yeah, it's the beginning of the thread of nude women in Tampa, I think. It's the beginning, So I actually thought about writing a chapter on strip clubs, like in the 70s and 80s and stuff, but I realized I already did it. I did it with the Imperial Theater, and that DNA, goes all the way back to that, where you had the B-girls selling booze, and basically it was like the strippers. They would sell booze, and they would sit down. So if I bought a drink from you, you would sit down with me, and I would watch the show. We would drink together, and you would make sure that I was buying lots of drinks, not just for myself but for you. And a lot of people think, like in retrospect, that these women were prostitutes. They were not. There was plenty of ladies for that around. These were just a notch above that. It was just feminine company. And then, of course, you had the people who actually acted or danced in these. This is a vaudeville theater, so it's a variety show. So you had girly shows, you had jugglers, you had actors and comedians, music, all that stuff. But, of course, the girly shows would have been especially popular here in Tampa at the time, or at least they were. So like I mentioned before, he was sort of a pioneer. I mean, one of the things he did was, rather than have completely nude women, he would backlight the women and have them dance in full-body stockings. So basically they looked nude, and their feminine forms were revealed, but when the police came to arrest them, they weren't actually naked, so they would have to charge them for being indecent, or something like that, rather than just naked. We would have known very little about this guy. The thing is, with Tampa, it's difficult, I think, as you guys know. There's not a lot of police records going back far,
There are not.
For obvious reasons, right? And there's just not a lot of other stuff to go on besides like city council records and things like that. So it was just a blessing. I had no idea that this Athanasaw had been arrested for the Mann Act when it was still, the White Slavery Act, when it was still kind of an untested thing. So they used him as a test case. And of course, later on, Jack Johnson, Chuck Berry, a whole bunch of other people, Charlie Chaplin even, were all arrested for this. But for Athanasaw, it was, bringing a girl in for a show, supposedly for immoral purposes. And it's a real interesting law, I think. It's all based upon what they think you are going to do rather than what you actually did. It would never hold up in court today.
Yeah. Well, also race-based, like you said, with later with Jack Johnson.
Right. If you notice, everyone I mentioned, was black or Jewish, whatever. All these cases had different amounts of merit. I mean, Chuck Berry was with a 14-year-old, but on the other hand, it was definitely wielded as a weapon. And what's interesting is that when they wrote the law, they assumed that all all the pimps out there were men. And so they didn't have any federal, penal institutions for women. And they found that, well over half of what they found were madams were the ones exploiting other women. And there was a big case that happened in Tampa that was a much better test case for what it was really meant to be for. But Athanasaw, he got the publicity, and basically city prosecutors didn't seem to be very, very interested in bringing him to justice. So when the feds got a hold of it, he received no quarter. So he went to prison.
So we have Athanasaw and we have the Imperial Theatre, which you tell the story in the book, and it's incredibly fascinating. And then things change, and then along comes Prohibition.
Right.
And then one of my favorite parts about the book is you tell the story of a very proactive judge, a guy that's determined to make Tampa dry.
Hell-bent, you could say.
Hell-bent to make Tampa dry. And this is a guy that you say in the book sips Coca-Cola and just whips through cases to get, bootleggers, even people consuming alcohol, to get them hit with huge fines and prison sentences. So what can you tell us about the good judge, and what does he tell us or what does his story tell us about Tampa history?
Yeah, Stalnaker. His first name escapes me strangely. Leo, of course. Leo Stalnaker. Man, what a character. Yeah, that was probably one of my favorite parts of the book, just because it's so story and character driven, rather than, I don't know, the forces and trends of history. And here's a guy who just, it was baked into his bones. I mean, being against all this stuff, he was just a fiery Methodist. Very much aligned with the Ku Klux Klan. They helped get him elected to the state legislature, where his big thing was pushing like a monkey bill. You weren't allowed to teach the theory of evolution. It never passed, but he made his name kind of on that in the 1920s. And then eventually we had a judge who, I don't know if he retired or anyway, but they had to replace a judge. They brought him in, and it was like oil and water. I mean, he was against alcohol and prohibition and all this stuff. And the municipal judge prosecuted criminal cases, but he was also an elected position. And we see this before, like in Ybor City with the constable. Their ward had its own constable, which is sort of like a city sheriff, for their ward of the city. So, I mean, anytime they elected a constable, it was a very crooked constable, so they could kind of do whatever they wanted to. And even if the crooked guy got beat, they could just stuff the ballot box. So the same thing, would happen to Stalnaker, but what a 6 months it was. It was like 5 months he was actually on the bench. And, he turned everything upside down, overnight. The idea was, like previously, if you got arrested selling Bolita, let's say you got a $100 fine, which was very minimal back then, and maybe you got a $25 fine if you bought a Bolita ticket. Well, suddenly, he tripled all the fines, and then it didn't make any difference if you bought a ticket or you sold one, or if you're selling alcohol or buying it. Mm-hmm. So it really made criminal penalties much stiffer, which, it should have happened probably generations before, because the criminal penalties were so low that if you were kind of a professional criminal, it just wouldn't matter at all. So I think he was trying to, have a more realistic policy, but the people didn't like it, and there's no way he was going to get reelected fairly, unfairly, any which way. So, and it's interesting because, some of the seeds of his own demise were built into his character too, and that eventually he got disbarred, not because the forces of evil were, trying to cripple him, but because, he did some things he wasn't supposed to do as well. And I'll let you read the book to figure out what that was.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, he's great. And like I said, he's sipping Coke, he's finding these people. Doesn't he light alcohol on fire one time that had gone through pipes to prove that it was alcohol? I think he lights it on the courtroom.
Right.
Lights it in the courtroom.
Yeah, he loved theater in the courtroom.
Yeah.
And then that's what got him so interested in film and filming all this stuff and trying to, really embarrass people and all that stuff. So
yeah, the people have to read the book and learn about the Key Club, which of course Stalnaker films well-known Tampans going into the Key Club, so he can then use that footage against them later.
Right.
But your book, of course, covers much more time. I mean, you take us all the way into the late 20th century. So we have Prohibition, it's this important moment. And then you have a great chapter where you talk about juke joints, you talk about dancing, and you talk about Tampa during World War II. So what should should we know about what you talk about during that period?
Well, I think it's interesting because it's, I mean, the beginning, the jazz age, well, really it starts before that, but this whole idea of kind of white people imitating black culture, I think that's an important part of the story because juke joints originally weren't very romantic places to go to, you know? I mean, these were places literally that if you had a work gang, it was just to make sure they didn't run away. You know, you would have enough booze there on Saturday night. You might truck women in as well. You might truck men in if you've got women on your work detail. And then they, you know, as a place for drinking, gambling, that kind of stuff. But it eventually sort of caught on and became this kind of edgy places for white people to go to, but their own jukes, you know. But they were notorious. Juke joints were, you know, very rough places and really an outgrowth of just the brutal brand of agriculture that Florida practiced, you know, all across the state at the time, which really required African American, you know, muscles. And, you know, now it's all been changed and, you know, it's mostly foreign workers and things like that. But at the time it was, you know, it was just kind of a fact of life. If you, these things would be way into the hinterland, they would be hidden away in the countryside, but they were very much a part of kind of the DNA of blues, you know, jazz, all this other stuff. And, you know, this goes back to right after emancipation. So this, you know, these things, I kind of think of them as incubators for culture, you know. You know, they think of it as just a place to have a throwaway Saturday night, but this is where the dances, the music, the lyrics, all this stuff, for what we know of as kind of the roots of African American culture, were developed largely outside of, you know, kind of the leadership of the white world.
Well, because it's a place where they have a space of their own. They're
Right.
not being watched by either a former master or by a work gang leader. You know, if they're on the turpentine, you know, working a big turpentine forest.
Right.
They had their own space.
Right.
And they could be themselves and just enjoy their own company.
Right.
Yeah, and as you said when we started off this interview, you know, you wanted to get at culture a different way and try to find out the lives of these people through, you know, avenues that really historians haven't explored that much, and the juke joint is definitely one of them.
Right.
And then it's so interesting that it crosses over, right? All of a sudden you have white patrons going to the juke joint.
Right.
They get really popularized right around this time.
Yeah, and the jitterbug dancing during World War II is really big. Everyone throwing each other around and all that stuff. All that stuff had come out of these same places, you know. It's just white people might get to it a generation later.
Yeah, a little safer form maybe.
Right, and, you know, and even though we had segregation here, it was still very porous, especially when you go out into the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
So you would have like white boys from the University of Florida who would be dared to go to a juke joint and would go, but after 10 a.m. there would be no whites in the black juke joint anymore. 10 p.m. rather was when the cops usually would make sure all the white people were out, and it would be a black-only zone, which can still be pretty dangerous for the people who were still there. But at least then it took away kind of the racial element.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and then people have to read the book too. You talk a lot about during World War II how there's an outbreak of VD here in Tampa, and you talk a little bit about prostitution and how basically the military and local officials are kind of jousting at each other about, you know, whose fault is this problem.
Right.
But the last thing we wanted to talk to you about today was, you know, when you think about Tampa and you think about going to a steakhouse, you always think about Burns.
Oh, right.
Comes to mind. But your book is really interesting in that you talk about a steakhouse that people that have been in Tampa definitely know about, but maybe new people, you know, they've only lived here maybe a decade or so, or people that, you know, are fresh off the boat in the sense that they just moved to Tampa. You talk about a steakhouse called Bar Cuse. Mm-hmm. And why is this place so important? Why did you choose to write about this steakhouse?
I mean, first of all, because I had so much information about it, and I thought it was a really compelling story. I mean, here's a family who came down, you know, during the post-war era, almost by accident. You know, the mother of the family, they were running a really successful upstate New York restaurant, and at one point, the mother got injured. The kid was getting over an illness, so she just had a vacation down here on Treasure Island. It was blown away. I mean, I try to imagine what the beaches would have looked like back then. She just fell in love, and it didn't take very long before they opened a restaurant down here, first in Treasure Island and then at Tampa International Airport. So what's neat is it tells a story of a family who comes down, you know, along with so many other families at that time, for tourism and to resettle in Florida. But then you also have the story of the airport, the early airport, and kind of this different era of air travel with luxury, and all that stuff where it's an aspirational thing, and the idea of just dining and watching people take off to go to who knows where is like a very romantic notion. Whereas today, I think we were all soured on the idea of, going to the airport to do anything but to fly. But it's interesting because it's also like the end of the chapter is sort of the corporate takeover of food in the airport, and now we're kind of getting to the point where we want more local flavor in the airport.
Exactly. So things have come full circle.
Right.
Not only with Bar Cuse as being kind of the highlight of not only a great restaurant, but a local restaurant. And we're doing that again, but also just the idea of quality food. And so Bar Cuse was one of the innovators in the quality steaks and things like that as well, right?
Yeah, I think it was well beyond. It was probably way too good for what it really needed to be for travelers, but for people who aren't traveling and just wanted a good steak, it was a great place to go. And it's interesting because it helps illuminate Burns' story a bit too. There's a little bit of a crossover there. They were friends. So yeah, and at first I thought it was an odd man out, sort of chapter, because there's there's no corruption going on and stuff like that, But I think it also shows a different side of Tampa. But one of the things about the book that I didn't think about before doing it is that it's really 10. I thought of naming it 10 Histories of Tampa, because it's 10 chapters and each one is about a very different thing. Some of them overlap a bit, but some of them are completely different. So in a way, it's like way more of a challenge to write 10 histories of Tampa, because, I think, you guys know, if you need to know this much to write, about it, you really need to know that much, as a historian, because you're following many different threads. You don't know which ones are going to pan out or be interesting. So it's like if there's, 10 chapters in there, each one of those I did, research to be way more. So yeah, that was the one traumatic thing was it was 155,000 words when I brought it to the publisher, and now it's 100,000 words. So cutting a third of the book out was like pretty difficult.
Killing your darlings.
There was some great stuff in there that I know you had to lose. I actually have a question. So Jody P, who bought your book because she loved the premise of it, wants to know if the many Florida cattle ranches helped create the proliferation of steakhouses in the Tampa Bay area. So we have a lot of steakhouses because they have a lot of a lot of beef cows, or is there a connection or not?
No, I think the connection is with, the reason why steakhouses were really big in Chicago initially is because that's where cattle were being dismantled, not where they were being grown or developed. So generally, steakhouses have to do with butchery.
Yeah, same with Kansas City. Similar.
Right, and New York was sort of the end of that line, and often where people had the most money to spend on steaks. So these refrigerated meat would be brought out to them. So no, there wasn't a big connection there. And if you think about it, like steakhouses weren't really a thing in Florida until after World War II, like with most of the country.
And you talk about it in the book, as America becomes more prosperous and people have more income, you see these steakhouses start to pop up, like Bar Cuse in the Tampa airport.
Exactly, the American diet. The changes in the American diet. And
this kind of standardization, I find it so interesting. And I mentioned it in the book that the steakhouse kind of takes away any ethnic trappings out of the food, So, we've long had Cuban and Spanish restaurants, but that was all played out by the 40s for a lot of people. They wanted something that was American, and it's not that the food is necessarily American; it's just not ethnic, So, and that's where we kind of get the template where you go to a steakhouse, steak, potato, green vegetable.
Is there any other questions, Roddy?
I don't believe so. If we want to wait for one more, if one comes, I do have just a quick question before we wrap it up. You do talk about so many personalities. Did you have a standout personality of all the folks that you chronicled? Because that's while your vehicle is saloons and steakhouses, certainly it's the people.
Right,
populate
absolutely.
Those places that makes for interesting.
Man,
stories.
I don't know. I'd like to invite them all to dinner and just let them fight it out, But Macker, obviously, I don't think I don't know. I don't know if we'd be interesting to talk to or not.
He probably would be pretty interesting. To talk
Right.
He's going to light your drink on fire.
I mean,
really.
but
Him and maybe
Athanasaur,
Robert Muggy together.
Muggy, yeah, Robert Muggy, the German kind of immigrant, all of them, yeah. I got to the point when I was working on the Columbia book, 10 years ago, I had dreams about interviewing former owners and stuff. It was like I was way too involved. So yeah, I mean, I could definitely see wanting to talk to all of them. Really.
Yeah, that'd be something else.
And then, of course, you've got the civil rights leaders, too. I mean, people like, I'd love to prick the brain of Francisco Rodriguez, the lawyer, just an amazing guy. Leon Lowry, all these other people. It's,
Get Sumter Lowry and Leon Lowry to get those two together.
right, well, there's another one. I mean, that would be very, very fascinating, right?
Yeah. So we actually have a lot of questions now. So we have Mike K. Was the judge Stalnaker related to the USF professor of the same unusual name?
Yes. That was his son, Leo Stalnaker Jr., and I believe he was like the advisor for the Oracle. So for many years he kind of helped run the Oracle.
That's cool.
So he must have gotten some writing experience because his father got into writing after he was disbarred, but he wrote fiction like pulp detective stuff.
All right, so what saloon you researched do you wish you were able to visit? That's from Jeff H.
Oh, man. I don't know. Yeah, I would love to see the old Cherokee Club. I mean, I'd love to see just be a fly on the wall in the Tampa Bay Hotel, in its first couple seasons, because it really, it just went downhill quick after that. But I don't know. And then some of these places you wouldn't want to go to. Like, I'm not sure if I want to go to the Columbia Restaurant in 1908. There's some stuff mentioned in here about how it was a nuisance saloon.
Yeah.
It wasn't even a restaurant yet. And,
yeah.
People were getting stabbed and shot there all the time. And it wasn't just the Columbia, but that whole intersection was just full of saloons. So, I mean, just to go back in time and see what that would have been like.
Exactly. Just to go into Old Fort Brooke and see what the town of Fort Brooke looked like with all the saloons they had down there.
So yeah, I mean, it certainly would have been fascinating. But some of the places it might be nice to visit, but you wouldn't want to stay.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've got Jody P again. Will you write a sequel to this book on the current state of restaurants? So obviously a lot of changes in restaurants.
No, I don't think so, because that was one of the things, like, at one time in the kind of late aughts, I was trying to do everything. So I was writing some reviews, and I was doing this and doing that, and doing my history. And, I just realized after a while, especially after upsetting some people, that, like, I'm not really that interested in writing about contemporary stuff and writing restaurant reviews, per se.
Yeah.
So, no, I don't think I would. If I were to do something, there would have to be some sort of a twist to it.
Yeah. Well, could the twist be, as Lori C. suggests, following up on Jody P., what are your thoughts about restaurants in the pandemic and the recent closing of La Tropicana? Tropicana closed as of maybe yesterday.
Right.
What do you think about that? And just in general, like how are they weathering this, and what's their path going forward?
It's unprecedented. So, I mean, it's precedented, actually. We've had lots of new plays before. This is just the first time that we try to shut everything down. I don't know. That's one. This historian doesn't have much much advice to give or insight. I mean, it's just. I find it changes the whole arithmetic of having a restaurant if you can only have like a third of the seats. Mm-hmm. So I just don't know how that's going to pan out.
Yeah, the margins are so tight.
Right, and they were already super tight. Yeah. So I think that we're just going to have to spend more when we go to restaurants.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be the bottom line, or they're going to close.
Yeah.
And I don't think the Tropicana was in a position to raise its prices.
Yeah, that's a fact.
Right.
So another question about the book and its availability. Of course, the book is available at the History Center gift shop. It's available in all the different places you can buy books, including University Press of Florida. So if you go to upress.ufl.edu and use the code TAMPA, you will get some kind of discount on this book. Hope it doesn't cut into your royalties. It doesn't come up.
I'm not really too concerned about royalties. Yeah, but definitely UPF. They got a great deal on free free delivery, I think, still. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, you definitely save some money there.
Yeah, and so members of the History Center also get discounts at our museum store. So if you'd like the feeling of looking at the book, which I think we're letting folks do, given our circumstances with the coronavirus, you can come down here, but you certainly can go online and order as well.
Well, the last thing I just wanted to say is the book is great, and there's so many stories we haven't talked about. I mean, you do a great thing about soup lines and soup kitchens, or in the cigar industry. You talk about desegregating lunch counters. So there's so many things that we haven't talked about today that people should really get the book. They should give it a read through. It's definitely my favorite history of Tampa. So I think you did a great job on the book.
Great.
So with that,
and also, wait, I want to thank both of you. Both of these guys were instrumental in kind of helping me get across the finish line too. So there was a lot of advice, that I asked for and things like that, and feedback. So thank you to both these guys.
It was a joy to read. And,
Absolutely.
And again, given what's going on, it's a shame that you're not going to be able to speak as much as you probably would to support the book.
Right.
But as things get back to normal here at the History Center, we are going to have Florida Conversations in some way, shape, or form, and we certainly going to invite you for that. And so those out there in internet land can keep an eye on our website for that information.
And we're also putting together an Ollie course for the fall.
Oh, there you go.
So so I'll be basically more or less teaching the book, so you can read it beforehand or after or during.
So if those of y'all that are interested in the Ollie course, that's run by USF, and it's a non-credit course that people really just take for enrichment. So you can spend some more time with Andy.
Yeah, and I think we're going to have it. I think we're having it here, but keep an eye out for details.
Exactly,
right
here or via visual or
out
virtually
there
here, exactly, in kind of the ether. But yeah, so thank you all so much for joining in with our Museums at Home, sponsored by Raymond James Financial Services, and it's been a real pleasure speaking with Andy, and of course, spending time with Brad. So thank you all so much.